The land sat quietly at the edge of the neighborhood, just as it had for many years. Tall trees marked the boundary, and an old gravel driveway led from the road to a modest house, set back far enough to feel private. The owner had chosen this place for that reason. He liked space. He liked peace. He liked knowing where his land began and where it ended. He had worked most of his adult life to own property outright, with no shared walls, no close neighbors, and no one telling him how to live on his own land. When he first bought the property, the neighborhood was still growing. New houses were being built nearby, and with them came a homeowners association. At the time, it did not seem like a problem. The association promised to keep the area clean and organized. It talked about shared values, safety, and protecting property values. The landowner read the documents carefully. His property was older, slightly outside the core development, and came with clear records showing where the association's authority stopped. Everything looked fine on paper. For a long while, life stayed quiet. He maintained his land, fixed his own fences, and kept to himself. He did not attend HOA meetings because he had no reason to. He paid attention to local laws, kept copies of permits, and stored all property records in a file he updated every year. This habit came from experience. He had learned long ago that paperwork mattered, even when things were calm. The first sign of trouble came as a simple letter. It arrived in the mailbox one afternoon, printed on official-looking paper. The message was polite, but firm. It said there was a concern about the appearance of his property. The letter claimed the grass near the road was too high and did not meet community standards. It asked him to address the issue within 2 weeks. He read the letter twice, then stepped outside. The grass near the road was trimmed. It was not perfect, but it followed county rules. More importantly, the road itself was not part of the HOA area. He checked his survey map to be sure. The map confirmed what he already knew. The land in question was fully his. Instead of reacting, he chose patience. He wrote a short response, explaining that his property was not subject to the association's landscaping rules. He included a copy of the survey and sent the letter by a certified mail. He expected that to be the end of it. It was not. A week later, another letter arrived. This one had a sharper tone. It mentioned a fine for noncompliance and warned that further action could follow. There was no mention of his previous response. It felt as if no one had read it. This time, he felt a mix of surprise and concern. He knew some associations could be aggressive, but this seemed careless. Still, he stayed calm. He made copies of everything and added notes with dates and times. He sent another response, more detailed than the first. He explained the boundary lines again and asked for a written confirmation that the matter was closed. Around the same time, he began to notice changes in the neighborhood. New board members had taken over the HOA. Signs went up reminding residents of rules. Letters were being sent out more often. Neighbors talked quietly about warnings and fines. Some people paid without question. Others complained, but felt powerless. The landowner listened, but did not join the conversations. He knew his situation was different. His land records were clear. He believed facts would matter. One afternoon, while repairing a section of fence near the edge of his property, a vehicle pulled up slowly along the road. A person wearing an HOA badge stepped out and began taking photos. The landowner watched from a distance. When the person noticed him, there was a brief, awkward pause. No greeting was offered. The photos continued. That moment changed how the situation felt. It no longer seemed like a paperwork mistake. It felt personal. Later that evening, another notice appeared in his mailbox. This one listed multiple issues: the fence style, the placement of a storage shed, and even the type of gravel used on the driveway. All of it was claimed to be in violation of community standards. He sat at his kitchen table and read the notice slowly. Each item described something that had existed long before the HOA expanded near his land. None of it fell under their authority. The list was long and the fines were adding up on paper. He did not feel angry. He felt focused. He spent the next few days reviewing documents. He pulled the original deed, the survey maps, county zoning records, and the HOA bylaws. He highlighted sections and placed sticky notes where the boundaries were clearly defined. The more he reviewed, the clearer it became. The association had no legal control over his property. He also noticed something else. The HOA documents were written in broad language, but they depended heavily on residents not challenging them. The rules sounded strong, but only within specific areas. Outside those areas, the authority disappeared. The landowner realized the association either did not understand its limits or did not care. He sent one final letter. This time, it was firm, but respectful. He stated that further contact regarding his property would be considered harassment. He requested that all future communication be directed through legal counsel. He included copies of the relevant documents and kept proof of delivery. For a short time, things went quiet. Weeks passed with no new letters. The neighborhood returned to its usual calm. The landowner continued his routines. He worked on small projects, walked his land, and enjoyed the quiet mornings he had always valued. Then one afternoon, a neighbor stopped by near the fence line. The neighbor spoke carefully, almost nervously. He mentioned that the HOA board had been discussing the landowner during meetings. They believed he was non-compliant and uncooperative. There was talk of enforcement. The landowner thanked the neighbor for the information. After the neighbor left, he stood alone for a long moment, looking across his property. He knew what enforcement usually meant for an HOA. Letters, fines, liens. But something about the tone of the conversation felt different. The association seemed determined to make an example out of him. That evening, he reviewed his records one more time and organized them neatly into a folder. He placed it by the door, not because he expected trouble, but because he believed in being prepared. He did not yet know how far the situation would go. He only knew one thing for sure. He was standing on land he legally owned, and he was not wrong. And somewhere behind closed doors, the association was making a decision that would soon turn a quiet property dispute into something much bigger. Days passed after the quiet, but the landowner sensed the calm was only temporary. The neighborhood seemed peaceful on the surface, yet something was brewing behind the closed doors of the HOA board. He noticed small signs, a neighbor whispering in passing, a delivery of more official-looking envelopes that had no name on them, and the occasional lingering look from someone at the edge of the road. It was subtle, but it carried weight. One morning, he found a letter that had been slipped under the door. The envelope was thick and had the HOA's logo printed boldly on the corner. Inside, the letter was long, dense, and full of technical language. It outlined multiple violations and cited sections of the HOA rules that did not apply to his property. The tone was sharper than before, almost accusatory. They claimed that by failing to comply, he was risking community safety and harmony. The landowner read it slowly, making notes as he went. Every claim was either inaccurate or irrelevant to his land. He highlighted sections that were based on assumptions rather than facts and marked every legal boundary with a sticky note. Even with all the effort to stay calm, he could feel a tension rising. The situation was no longer about simple misunderstanding. It was becoming personal. He took the letter outside and walked along the edge of his property. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the land he had worked to care for. He had planted these trees himself, repaired this fence, and maintained the land for years. Nothing he had done was wrong, yet here was a document claiming otherwise. For the first time, he allowed a flicker of frustration to pass through him. Despite this, he did not act out of anger. He knew that reaction could be used against him. He returned inside, brewed a cup of coffee, and began drafting a careful response. This letter was different from the previous ones. He included a clear statement of his property rights, referenced legal documents, and insisted that any further action be stopped unless supported by law. He also requested that all future communication be in writing. After sending the letter by certified mail, he felt a sense of relief, though temporary. He knew the HOA might not respond with reason. They had already shown that caution and facts were not enough to stop their efforts. Still, he continued his routines, repairing a section of the fence, clearing debris, and tending to the small vegetable garden he enjoyed. Keeping busy grounded him, and he tried to focus on the things he could control. However, subtle signs of escalation began appearing. One morning, he noticed tire marks in the gravel driveway that did not match his vehicle's. Small pieces of paper with unclear notes were left at the edge of the property. Someone had been there. It was not threatening in a direct way, but the intent to monitor was clear. He did not confront anyone, but he made notes and photographs of everything. One afternoon, he heard voices near the road. He looked from the porch and saw two individuals standing by a car, speaking quietly but glancing in his direction. It was impossible to tell who they were or what they wanted. He did not approach, but he made mental notes and jotted them down later. The feeling of being watched made the air heavy. It was a small intrusion, but it carried a silent message. The HOA was paying attention as the days went by. More letters arrived, each more demanding than the last. They threatened fines, liens, and other forms of enforcement that seemed to grow in severity. They included instructions for compliance that were impossible to meet and deadlines that were unreasonably short. It felt as though the HOA was testing the landowner, trying to push him into reacting rational. The landowner realized he was being pulled into a larger battle. The situation was no longer just about his property. It was about authority, control, and a misunderstanding of limits. He spent hours reviewing state laws and county ordinances, noting which sections supported his ownership rights. He even contacted a local legal advisor for informal guidance. Not because he expected immediate action, but because he wanted to be fully prepared. One evening, as the sun began to set, the landowner sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and maps. His mind wandered through the sequence of events: the first letter, the ignored response, the fines, the driveway tire marks. He understood clearly that this was an escalation pattern. They were trying to intimidate him into submission, relying on fear rather than facts. He felt a moment of unease, but quickly replaced it with determination. The landowner had faced challenges before in life and work. He knew that staying calm, documenting everything, and relying on facts was the strongest strategy. Anger could cloud judgment. Panic could weaken resolve. Instead, he focused on preparation, ensuring that he had everything in order to defend himself if the situation worsened. Then came an unexpected encounter. A board member of the HOA appeared at the edge of his property. There was no knock or announcement, just a sudden presence. The person spoke carefully, warning that the association had more serious steps planned if compliance was not achieved. The landowner listened, calmly noting the tone and language. There was no need to respond immediately. He thanked the person and walked back inside. He recorded the incident in his notes and took photos of the surroundings. After that, he started noticing more small, subtle intrusions. Flyers left on the mailbox, distant glances from vehicles slowly driving past, and neighbors asking indirect questions about his plans. Each event on its own might have seemed minor, but together they painted a picture of systematic pressure. It was clear that the HOA was not just enforcing rules, they were building a case, hoping for a reaction that could be labeled as non-compliance or defiance. At night, he reflected on his situation while walking along the tree line. He thought about how often people give up in similar circumstances. He had seen stories of neighbors who complied immediately with every demand, fearing confrontation or fines. He knew this path would not protect the land. Ownership required courage and attention to detail. He reminded himself of the importance of patience and planning. He also began to think strategically. If the HOA continued its aggressive tactics, legal action might become necessary. He reviewed all possible outcomes, ensuring he could respond calmly to each. He mapped out the property, checked boundary lines, and made a digital backup of every document he had gathered. It was not paranoia, it was preparedness. As the tension grew, so did his confidence. He understood the association's limitations and the strength of his own position. The knowledge was comforting. He could feel that the next move from the HOA would reveal whether they were serious about enforcing authority, or whether they were overstepping their bounds entirely. Despite the escalating pressure, he maintained normal routines. He repaired fences, mowed parts of the property, and checked the animals in the small barn. He found solace in these small acts of care. The land was his responsibility, and tending to it reminded him of the real reason he had invested in the property: freedom, peace, and the ability to live without interference when it was lawful. And so, the quiet neighborhood prepared to face a storm it had not anticipated. While the landowner remained calm, steady, and fully aware of his rights, the HOA continued its strategy, believing intimidation and repeated demands could force compliance. The stage was set for the next escalation, and the landowner, equipped with knowledge, patience, and determination, waited for the confrontation that was coming. The morning air was crisp and clear when the first signs of real trouble appeared. The landowner had just finished checking the barn and straightening the tools in the workshop when he heard the distant sound of a siren. At first, he thought it was a passing vehicle, but it came closer, steady and insistent. Moments later, flashing lights appeared down the driveway. He froze for a second, trying to understand what was happening. 2 police cars slowly drove up, the officers stepping out carefully, looking around. They approached him on the porch and identified themselves politely. The landowner stepped forward, calm but alert. He had anticipated this possibility, but seeing it unfold in real life created a weight that even preparation could not remove entirely. The officers explained they had received a call from the HOA, reporting possible trespassing and violations. They said they were there to investigate. The landowner listened carefully, nodding, and kept his hands visible. He knew that staying calm and factual was his best defense. He presented the documents he had meticulously collected: deeds, surveys, county records, and correspondence with the HOA, he explained, in simple, clear terms, that the property was entirely his, and none of the claims the HOA had made were valid. He offered copies for the officers to review. The first officer took the documents and began scanning them. He asked a few questions about the boundaries, the placement of buildings, and the driveway. The landowner answered patiently, pointing out specific survey lines and legal descriptions. Meanwhile, the second officer walked the perimeter, looking at the fence, the driveway, and the small barn. He took notes quietly, occasionally glancing at the first officer as they discussed in hushed tones. The landowner waited, understanding that perception was important. He did not raise his voice or show frustration. He simply remained polite, steady, and cooperative. After a few tense minutes, the officers regrouped and spoke. They acknowledged that the landowner's documents were thorough and accurate. They admitted that the HOA's claims were based on incomplete information and, in some cases, misunderstandings. One officer remarked that the HOA had overstepped its authority in several areas. The landowner nodded, careful not to celebrate prematurely. The officers explained that they could not enforce the HOA's demands because there was no legal basis. They reminded him that the HOA could pursue civil action through the courts, but the police could only intervene if actual laws were broken. The landowner thanked them for their time and attention, offering copies of the documents for their records. The officers appreciated the clarity and professionalism, then returned to their vehicles and left. After the cars disappeared down the driveway, the landowner felt a mixture of relief and concern. The immediate threat was over, but the situation was far from resolved. The HOA had already escalated, and the involvement of law enforcement, even if brief, signaled that they might attempt other strategies. He knew he needed to prepare for further moves. In the days that followed, he focused on organizing every detail. He made extra copies of all deeds, surveys, and correspondence. He digitized documents and created backups in multiple locations. Every photo, note, and letter was carefully filed. He also took the time to mark boundaries with temporary stakes, creating a visible line that could be referenced if needed. Neighbors began noticing the tension. Some stopped by cautiously, offering quiet words of support. Others observed from a distance, unsure of how to act. The landowner appreciated the concern but remained independent in his planning. He had always valued self-reliance, and now that value guided his every decision. Meanwhile, the HOA sent more letters, increasing the fines and emphasizing potential consequences. They claimed that ignoring their rules could lead to legal penalties. The landowner read each letter carefully, comparing it to the law and his own documentation. Every claim was refuted, and he responded to each, sending copies by certified mail. He kept detailed notes about delivery dates, recipients, content. The tension began to affect the atmosphere in the neighborhood. Friends and acquaintances whispered about the situation. Some warned him to be careful, while others suggested legal counsel. The landowner appreciated the advice but relied on his own research and judgment. He was confident that facts, not fear, would prevail. One afternoon, a new letter arrived, this one more aggressive. The HOA suggested that the police might return if compliance was not achieved, implying that law enforcement could be involved again. The landowner did not panic. He understood that the officers he had already met had seen the facts and were unlikely to act. Without clear evidence of illegal activity, he drafted another response, this time summarizing all prior communication and emphasizing that the HOA had no authority to enforce its rules on his property. He reiterated that any further attempts to involve law enforcement without factual basis could be considered harassment. Once again, he sent the letter via certified mail and kept the receipt as he continued his daily routine. Small signs of intrusion persisted. Flyers appeared on the mailbox with warnings or vague threats. Vehicles lingered near the property during the day. The landowner observed quietly, recording each incident. He understood the value of patience and detailed records. Every observation was a piece of evidence that could protect him if matters escalated further. Despite the pressure, he also recognized the importance of maintaining his life and well-being. He spent mornings tending to his garden, repairing sections of the fence, and checking the barn. Evenings were reserved for reflection, planning, and organizing his files. He did not allow fear to dictate his schedule. Neighbors began asking questions indirectly. One morning, a resident stopped at the edge of the road and asked about the police visit. The landowner explained politely, emphasizing that the property was legally his and that the officers had seen the facts for themselves. The neighbor nodded, reassured by the clarity, and walked away. It became clear that some in the community were beginning to question the HOA's actions. The landowner also started to anticipate potential next steps from the HOA. He reviewed local laws, researched past cases involving overreach by homeowners associations, and noted any legal precedents. He wanted to ensure that if the situation escalated to court, he would be prepared to defend his rights effectively. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, he walked along the edge of his property, reflecting on the situation. He understood that knowledge and patience were his strongest tools. Acting hastily could create vulnerabilities. Staying calm, documenting every interaction, and relying on facts would provide the best protection in his mind. He replayed the police visit repeatedly, analyzing every detail. He felt gratitude for the professionalism of the officers and satisfaction in knowing that his preparation had made a difference. The landowner realized that the HOA's strategy relied heavily on intimidation. By remaining composed and informed, he had neutralized their first major attempt to exert control. As night fell, he returned to the house, confident yet vigilant. The confrontation with law enforcement had proven one thing: he had the facts and he was in the right. The HOA could continue sending letters, increasing fines, and hinting at action. But any further escalation would be met with careful, deliberate responses. He understood that the situation was far from over. The next steps could involve legal battles, more aggressive HOA tactics, or attempts to rally neighbors against him. Yet he remained steadfast. The property was his, the documents were clear, and he had taken the proper steps to ensure that any authority attempting to challenge him without legal basis would fail. In the quiet of the evening, as he sat by the window watching the last light fade from the trees, he reflected on the unfolding story. He realized that ownership was not just about holding a deed, it was about protecting it, understanding the law, and standing firm when others attempted to impose control without justification. He was ready for whatever came next. After the police had left, the landowner knew the battle was far from over. The HOA, frustrated by their inability to enforce rules on his property, began to escalate their actions in other ways. Notices became more formal and urgent. Letters arrived in heavier envelopes, and their language grew more pointed. But the landowner remained steady. He had seen their limits, and he knew that facts and preparation were his strongest allies. He spent the next several days reviewing every piece of correspondence. He created a timeline, noting dates, times, and responses. He also summarized each letter in his own words, pointing out the inaccuracies and misstatements. The process was meticulous, almost meditative. By focusing on facts and organization, he kept his mind clear and avoided the stress that the HOA was trying to provoke. Neighbors began to notice changes, too. Some who had previously followed the HOA's advice now looked hesitant. Rumors spread that the police had seen the landowner's documentation and had confirmed that the HOA's claims were unfounded. Quiet conversations suggested that the board might be overstepping, and some residents wondered if their own properties could face similar pressure. If the HOA was willing to challenge someone so confidently, the landowner continued his routines. Tending to the land and maintaining the structures on the property, he repaired fences, painted the barn, and cleared paths through the woods. These simple acts reminded him why he had purchased the land in the first place: the freedom to care for it and enjoy it without interference. Each day of calm productivity built his confidence further. Then, the HOA made their next move. They sent an official notice threatening legal action, suggesting that the landowner's non-compliance could result in court proceedings. They hinted at fines, liens, and other penalties. The tone of the letter was aggressive, implying that ignoring their demands could have serious consequences. It was clear they were trying to intimidate him. The landowner read the letter carefully and made detailed notes. He referenced every claim against his own documentation, noting the discrepancies and errors. He responded in writing, calmly but firmly, explaining that the HOA had no authority to enforce rules on his property. He also included copies of relevant laws, deeds, and survey maps, ensuring that there would be no confusion about the legality of his ownership. Within a few days, the HOA sent yet another letter, this one even more insistent. They suggested that the police might return if the disputes were not resolved. The landowner, however, knew that law enforcement would only intervene if a real law had been broken. Their earlier visit had confirmed that no violation existed, and he trusted that the facts would continue to support him as he prepared for potential court proceedings. The landowner began to see cracks in the HOA's approach. Their letters grew repetitive, recycling the same inaccurate claims over and over. Internal inconsistencies appeared in their documents, showing a lack of coordination and understanding of the legal limits. It became clear that the HOA was relying on intimidation rather than facts. He also began documenting every exciting interaction with neighbors. Conversations that once seemed casual now became opportunities to understand how the community perceived the situation. Some residents shared stories of receiving similar letters, hinting that the board might be overreaching more broadly. Others offered quiet support, acknowledging the landowner's careful, lawful approach. As days turned into weeks, the pressure from the HOA slowly began to weaken. Their attempts to enforce authority had not succeeded, and their credibility was being questioned. One board member, unsure of the legality of the claims, reached out privately to clarify the boundaries of authority. The landowner explained, again calmly, where the HOA's limits ended. The conversation, while brief, signaled a shift. Even within the board, doubts about their approach were growing. Around the same time, the landowner's attorney made a formal inquiry on his behalf. A letter was sent to the HOA, summarizing the legal situation and emphasizing that any further harassment could result in legal consequences. The language was clear but professional, avoiding threats while underscoring the seriousness of the matter. The board members received this letter and could no longer ignore the possibility of repercussions if they continued to push unfounded claims. The landowner continued his daily life, confident but vigilant. He maintained the property, tended to the barn, and walked the grounds, appreciating the trees and the open space. The land, which had once been a simple place of quiet enjoyment, had become a stage for asserting rights and fairness. Yet he approached it with calm and respect. Avoiding escalation through anger or rash decisions, community perception began to shift noticeably. Word spread that the landowner had met with police and had well-documented proof of ownership. Residents who had once feared fines and letters began to question the HOA's authority. Casual conversations reflected skepticism about the board's decisions. And some members of the HOA grew frustrated with their own leadership's approach. The landowner recognized that patience and diligence were turning the tide. While the HOA continued to send letters, their impact diminished. The repetition of inaccurate claims and aggressive language was losing effect. And neighbors were starting to see the situation with fresh eyes. The landowner's calm, evidence-based approach was creating respect. Even among those who had initially assumed the HOA's position was correct. In the evenings, he reflected on the events of the past weeks. The experience had been exhausting, yet it had reinforced the importance of preparation, patience, and clear documentation. He realized that the key to navigating this challenge was not confrontation, but consistent, fact-based response. He had stood firm, respected the law, and maintained his dignity throughout the ordeal. By the end of this phase, the HOA's authority had begun to crumble in the face of clear evidence and steady resolve. The landowner had successfully protected his property, and the board's attempts to intimidate him were proving ineffective. Community members were noticing, and even some HOA leaders quietly acknowledged the limits of their reach. The landowner understood that vigilance was still necessary. Legal challenges or further letters could appear at any time. Yet the first wave of intimidation had failed, and the outcome was becoming clearer. Facts, preparation, and calm persistence had turned the situation in his favor, demonstrating that careful, lawful action can overcome aggressive tactics. As night fell, he walked the property one last time before heading inside. The lights of the house glowed warmly through the trees, reflecting a sense of peace that had survived despite the challenges. He knew that the next steps might still bring conflict, but he also knew that he had proven the strength of preparation and patience. The land was his. The facts were clear, and the community's perception was shifting. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a quiet moment of satisfaction and confidence. The days after the HOA's authority began to crumble were filled with quiet observation and careful reflection for the landowner. He continued his routines, tending the garden, repairing fences, and walking the boundaries of his property. But there was a new sense of calm in the air. Letters and threats from the HOA became less frequent, and the tone of communication started to shift. The once aggressive and intimidating organization seemed cautious. Perhaps realizing that their strategy had failed, neighbors began to approach him more openly. Some admitted that they had feared the HOA and its influence, but seeing the landowner stand firm gave them confidence. Others came by to ask questions about property boundaries, legal rights, and how to handle similar situations. The landowner shared what he knew carefully, without gloating, emphasizing that preparation, calm, and respect for the law were the keys to protecting one's property. His example quietly inspired the community, showing that knowledge and patience could withstand even persistent intimidation. Despite the apparent calm, the landowner remained vigilant. He knew that the HOA could still attempt legal action or seek to regain influence through other channels. He reviewed every letter carefully, continued maintaining meticulous records, and made sure that all communications were documented. Each day of careful preparation reinforced his confidence, making him ready for any potential challenge. Then came a turning point. A board member of the HOA, speaking quietly and privately, admitted that the organization had overstepped its authority. Internal discussions had revealed gaps in understanding of the legal limits. Some members expressed concern about possible repercussions. The landowner listened calmly, confirming facts and boundaries, making it clear that his position was backed by law. This interaction marked the first acknowledgement of error by the HOA, and it was a subtle but significant victory. Over the next few weeks, the HOA's aggressive tactics slowed significantly. Fines and threats ceased, and letters became formal notices without the previous intensity. The landowner remained cautious, continuing to maintain the property and document interactions. but the sense of constant pressure began to lift. He could feel that the power dynamic had shifted. Where intimidation once loomed, reason and facts now guided perception. The community, too, began to recognize the change. Conversations reflected curiosity rather than fear, and some neighbors expressed admiration for the landowner's steadfastness. People began to question the authority of the HOA in other matters. Inspired by how one individual calmly and lawfully had defended his rights, it became clear that standing firm and knowing one's rights could influence the wider environment. The landowner also began to reflect on the personal lessons of the experience. Patience, attention to detail, and calm perseverance had allowed him to navigate a situation that might have overwhelmed someone less prepared. Anger or impulsive reactions would have given the HOA leverage. Instead, measured responses and thorough documentation had provided protection and clarity. The ordeal reinforced his belief that preparation and knowledge were essential tools in defending one's rights. As he walked through the property one evening, watching the sun dip behind the trees, he considered the journey. From the first letter to the last acknowledgement of overreach, he had moved through tension, observation, and preparation. He had faced pressure, uncertainty, and attempts at intimidation, yet he had remained grounded. Each step had been deliberate, guided by law, facts, a steady sense of responsibility to his land. Eventually, the HOA ceased direct communication with him. Any remaining concerns were relegated to minor bureaucratic notes that held no legal weight. The landowner continued to receive updates about the neighborhood, but the personal pressure that had defined the previous months was gone. His property was secure, his rights upheld, and the community now viewed the situation through the lens of clarity rather than fear. With the resolution of the immediate conflict, the landowner also noticed a ripple effect. Other residents, observing the outcome, began to educate themselves about property laws, HOA, boundaries, and the importance of documentation. Some quietly thanked him for demonstrating that it was possible to stand firm without confrontation. Showing respect for both law and community, he also understood that respect for the land and the law were intertwined. By maintaining his property with care and adhering to legal principles, he had demonstrated responsibility, not only to himself, but to the community. The property remained a place of peace, beauty, and productivity, a testament to his efforts and determination. While the experience had been challenging, it ultimately reinforced a sense of empowerment. The landowner realized that challenges would always arise. But by staying calm, documenting facts, and understanding legal limits, one could navigate even the most persistent pressure. It was not about winning or losing in the traditional sense, but about standing firm in truth and law, maintaining integrity, and protecting what was rightfully yours. As weeks turned into months, life returned to a stable rhythm. The property thrived, the landowner's routines continued, and the community had adjusted to the new understanding of boundaries and authority. The HOA remained in the background, but their influence over his property was clearly limited. The quiet satisfaction of knowing his rights were secure allowed him to fully enjoy the land, the trees and the open skies. In the end, the landowner reflected on the full journey. The first letters, the police visit, the intense pressure, and the eventual acknowledgement of overreach by the HOA had all contributed to a deep understanding of responsibility, patience, and resilience. He had learned that preparation, knowledge, and calm perseverance could overcome even aggressive challenges. He also recognized the broader lesson for the community. Authority has limits, and knowledge is powerful. When one stands firmly within the law, armed with facts and careful preparation, even the most persistent attempts at intimidation can be countered. The neighborhood learned this lesson quietly. Observing the outcome and adjusting their expectations of what was acceptable, the landowner's property returned to its intended purpose, a place of quiet work, personal projects, and enjoyment of nature. The barn, fences, and gardens thrived. The trees provided shade and privacy. The land was secure, and so was the sense of freedom that had motivated him to purchase it in the first place. as he walked along the boundaries. One last time, in the soft glow of the evening, he reflected on the months of tension and uncertainty. The experience had tested patience, legal knowledge, and composure. It had also strengthened confidence in the power of preparation, calm reasoning, and steadfast adherence to law. The HOA had learned that authority without understanding was fragile, and the landowner had demonstrated that knowledge and patience could protect what was rightfully yours. The community's perception had shifted. The HOA had been restrained, and the property remained under rightful control. Life returned to a sense of normalcy, but the lessons remained vivid. The landowner now carried the knowledge that, even in the face of aggressive challenges, calm, preparation, and adherence to law would prevail. And with that, he returned to his home, closing the door behind him. Satisfied that the land, his rights, and the integrity of his actions had all been preserved. The story, while challenging, had ended in quiet triumph, leaving both the landowner and the community with lasting lessons about patience, preparation, and the proper exercise of authority. The landowner felt a quiet satisfaction as the days moved on. After months of letters, fines, and threats, the pressure from the HOA had finally begun to ease. Their aggressive tone had softened, and official correspondence became minimal, almost cautious. It was clear they had realized the limits of their authority, and the landowner had proved that calm preparation and patience could withstand intimidation. He continued his daily routines with a renewed sense of purpose. Mornings were spent checking the fences and barn, ensuring everything was in order. Afternoons were for tending the garden and walking the property lines. Every action reinforced his connection to the land and reminded him why he had fought to protect it. Unlike before, the chores no longer carried tension. They were acts of care and enjoyment. Neighbors began to approach him more openly. Some admitted they had been wary of the HOA's power, but seeing the landowner stand firm gave them courage. They asked questions about property boundaries, legal rights, and how to handle conflicts with homeowners' associations. The landowner shared his knowledge calmly, emphasizing that patience, accurate documentation, and respect for the law were crucial. His measured approach inspired confidence and trust, and slowly, the community's perception of the HOA shifted, although the immediate threat had diminished. The landowner remained vigilant. He continued to organize and review all letters, notes, and documents. He knew that a sudden attempt to enforce authority could still occur. His careful record-keeping, once a tool of defense, now served as reassurance that he could respond quickly if necessary. Preparation had been key, and he understood its ongoing importance. One afternoon, a board member of the HOA visited the property, but this time the tone was different. There was a quiet acknowledgement of overreach, a willingness to clarify boundaries, and a subtle admission that their prior actions had been mistaken. The landowner listened carefully, providing clear explanations and referencing legal documentation. The conversation ended respectfully, marking a turning point in the dynamic between him and the association. The HOA's letters became even less frequent and lost their threatening edge. They sent only formal notices, devoid of the aggressive language and fines that had once filled the mailbox. It was evident that the board had reassessed its position and understood that further attempts at intimidation would likely backfire. The landowner, while relieved, continued his meticulous tracking of communications, knowing that maintaining accuracy was the best safeguard. Community opinion continued to shift. Neighbors began discussing the situation quietly among themselves, often referencing the landowner's calm approach. They realized that knowledge of the law and a steady response could counteract the fear tactics the HOA had employed. Some residents expressed admiration for his patience and thoroughness, acknowledging that his approach had set a strong example. The landowner also reflected on the personal lessons learned from the ordeal. Patience had allowed him to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. Careful documentation had provided a clear, indisputable record. Calm perseverance had prevented the situation from escalating into unnecessary conflict. Each of these qualities had played a vital role in protecting his property and rights. Evenings were now moments of reflection rather than tension. He walked along the property lines, observing the trees, fences, and garden beds he had maintained. The land had returned to its intended purpose, a place of quiet work, personal projects, and the freedom to enjoy the outdoors. The peace he had sought when purchasing the property was now fully restored as the weeks passed. Any remaining influence of the HOA over his property diminished. Their authority was effectively limited, and the landowner's clear, lawful stance had prevented further harassment. He continued to receive updates about the neighborhood, but there was no longer a personal threat. The battle had been won quietly and effectively, through preparation, knowledge, and measured action. The landowner also noticed a subtle ripple effect in the community. Others began to educate themselves about property rights and the limits of HOA authority. Casual conversations reflected an increased awareness of what was lawful and what was overreach. Observing his example encouraged neighbors to question aggressive tactics and rely on facts rather than fear. Throughout this period, he maintained a balance between vigilance and normal life. The barn and fences were kept in good repair, the garden flourished, and the small paths through the woods provided space for thought and reflection. The landowner found satisfaction in these daily routines, knowing that they were acts of stewardship, not just maintenance. Each day reinforced his sense of control and peace. Looking back, he saw the months of tension as a series of lessons. He had learned that authority can be challenged respectfully, that documentation and knowledge provide strength, and that calm perseverance can overcome intimidation. The experience had been exhausting, but it had also demonstrated that careful, lawful action could preserve both rights and dignity. The HOA's retreat was complete. Letters were rare, fines non-existent, and the board's aggressive stance had softened entirely. Neighbors began to view the situation as a testament to the power of preparation and informed action. The landowner had proven that intimidation could be countered with facts and patience. And the community quietly acknowledged this achievement. The landowner returned to the daily joys of his property, appreciating the beauty of the land and the freedom it provided. The barn, fences, and garden were thriving, and the trees offered shade and privacy. The property had been tested and emerged secure. Ownership was not just about holding a deed, it was about understanding rights, standing firm, and maintaining integrity. In the final reflection, he understood that life would continue to bring challenges, but he had proven that calm, deliberate, and informed action could overcome aggressive tactics. The HOA had learned its limits, and the landowner had affirmed his rights. Both the property and the sense of personal freedom had been preserved as the sun set over the trees. Casting long shadows across the land, he walked the boundaries one last time that day, appreciating the quiet victory. The land was safe. The community had learned from the example. The lessons of patience, preparation, and persistence had been firmly established. The story, while filled with tension and challenge, had concluded in a manner that honored both law and personal integrity. He returned to his home, closing the door behind him, feeling the calm that comes after standing firm and seeing justice, or at least fairness, prevail. The HOA would remain part of the community, but its influence over his property was clearly limited. The land was secure, his rights upheld, and his sense of confidence and peace restored. This chapter of his life had ended, leaving both the landowner and the community with a clear understanding of the value of preparation, knowledge, and steadfast resolve.